It was late October, just after midnight, and I was driving along the winding back roads of upstate New York. Late-night drives have always helped me unwind. There's something about the quiet roads, the cool night air, and the steady hum of the car that just makes everything else fade away. Rachel and I were heading to a cabin in the Adirondacks for the weekend, trying to escape all the stress of work and the noise of the city. We both needed a break. The radio was playing old rock songs, and Rachel had her head resting against the window, her eyes half closed. The road ahead was calm, lit by the moonlight. But out here, so far from everyone, I couldn't shake this little nagging feeling. What if something went wrong? I tried to ignore it. This weekend was supposed to be relaxing. Everything seemed fine. We passed a few road signs, the occasional farmhouse, but otherwise, it was just us. As we went around a curve, Rachel suddenly sat up, squinting at something ahead. There was a person, a woman, standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the headlights. Rachel told me to slow down, so I eased off the gas. The headlights lit her up, and she looked rough, hair all tangled, clothes dirty. She was waving her arms like crazy. Rachel motioned for me to pull over, and I could see why. The woman looked desperate. Rachel cracked the window open and asked if she was okay. The woman rushed over, her voice shaky, as she explained that her car had broken down a little way back. She said she needed a ride to her house, which wasn't far. I glanced at Rachel, and she looked back at me. Something felt strange, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and the woman seemed to really need help. Rachel gave me a small nod, and I sighed, unlocking the back door, telling her to get in. The woman climbed into the back seat, struggling with her seatbelt. She kept glancing out the window, her eyes darting around. She thanked us over and over, saying her house was just up the road. I pulled back onto the road, the tires crunching on the gravel as I drove. She directed us to take a narrow dirt path off the main road, leading deeper into the woods. The farther we went, the more I started to worry. The headlights barely cut through the darkness. I asked if she was sure this was the right way, trying to keep my voice steady. She insisted it was, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Rachel tapped her knee nervously, glancing at me. Finally, the road opened up into a small clearing, and the woman pointed ahead, saying we could drop her off there. I slowed the car to a stop, but then Rachel stiffened, her eyes widening. Shadows, people, were coming out of the trees, moving toward us. There were at least 6 of them, all wearing masks. Rachel whispered for me to look. I didn't think, I just reacted. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning before they finally caught the dirt. The woman in the back seat started screaming, grabbing at my shoulder, yelling for me to stop. I shook her off, hitting the gas. The car lurched backward, the headlights bouncing over the rough path. Rachel twisted in her seat. One of the masked people lunged at the car, hitting the rear window with a loud thud. Rachel shouted, and I didn't need to be told twice. I spun the wheel, the car skidding as it turned back onto the main road. I floored the gas, the engine roaring as we sped away. The woman in the back seat kept screaming, but her voice sounded strange, almost inhuman. Rachel turned to look at her, and her face changed. Her eyes went dark, and her mouth curled into this creepy grin. She hissed that we couldn't leave, her voice all distorted. Without saying a word, I swerved the car, throwing her against the door. The handle clicked, and before Rachel could even react, the door flew open, and the woman fell out, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles tight. Rachel stared out the window. The road felt endless. After what seemed like hours, we finally saw the lights of a small diner. I pulled into the parking lot, the car coming to a shaky stop. We sat there for a moment, the engine making clicking noises as it cooled, neither of us saying anything. Rachel finally broke the silence, asking what had just happened. I shook my head, admitting I didn't know, but said we were never stopping for anyone again. We got out of the car, our legs shaky as we walked into the diner. The bright lights and the smell of coffee were comforting. We found a booth in the corner, and a waitress came over, smiling warmly but looking curious as she saw how messed up we looked. She asked if we'd had a rough night. I forced a smile as I picked up the menu, replying that she could say that. Rachel looked out the window, scanning the dark parking lot, still feeling uneasy. She turned back to me, her voice low, saying we were never taking the back roads again. I nodded, agreeing with her. The fog rolled in fast, covering the road ahead. It was late November, and I was driving through the back roads of Oregon to help my friend Mike move some furniture. Mike's the kind of guy who would drop everything to help a friend, and I owed him big time. We've been friends since high school, and he's always been there for me through tough times. Breakups, job issues, you name it. So when he called earlier in the week asking for help, I said yes without thinking twice. Plus, I thought it'd be a nice change from my boring routine. The drive was supposed to be a chance to clear my head. Life had been pretty dull lately, and I was looking forward to hanging out with Mike. He could make even boring chores like moving furniture fun. But as the fog got thicker, I started feeling uneasy. What was supposed to be a relaxing drive quickly turned creepy. The farther I went, the more isolated I felt. The air was damp, and the mist surrounded me, muffling the sound of my tires on the wet road. My headlights barely cut through the thick gray fog in front of me, and soon I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Out of nowhere, the car sputtered, lurched, and then the engine died. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the fog all around me. I tried the ignition again, but the engine just coughed and went silent. I muttered a few curses, looking around. I was completely alone, with just the dim headlights and the shifting fog. I got out of the car, and the cold fog seeped right through my jacket. The road was empty, and the silence was unsettling. I popped the hood, hoping for a simple fix, but I wasn't much of a mechanic. After messing around a bit, it was clear I was stuck here. As I leaned over the engine, I heard something. A faint crunch of gravel. I straightened up, peering into the fog. The sound came again, closer this time. I squinted into the mist, trying to see what was making the noise. Then I saw him, a figure moving toward me in the middle of the road. He was wearing a long coat, and as he got closer, I saw he was holding something in his hand. It glinted faintly in the dim light. It was a knife. I instinctively backed away from the car. The guy didn't say anything. He just kept coming, his eyes locked on me. His face was blank and emotionless, which somehow made it even scarier. I turned and ran to the other side of the car, keeping it between us. The fog was so thick I could barely see, and I tripped over the uneven ground. I scrambled to my feet and looked over the car hood. The man was still coming, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, getting closer and closer. I had nowhere to go, no way to escape. My phone was inside the car, but even if I reached it, there was no guarantee I'd get a signal out here. Suddenly, I heard another sound. A distant rumble cutting through the fog. A light appeared, faint at first, then got brighter. It was coming fast. A motorcycle roared out of the mist, the headlight cutting through the fog. The rider skidded to a stop a few yards away, his helmeted head turning toward me and the guy with the knife. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked between me and the biker. The motorcyclist revved the engine, the roar echoing through the empty road. The guy with the knife took a step back, his expression shifting. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the fog, as suddenly as he had appeared. The rider gestured for me to come over, keeping the engine running. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled around the car, my legs shaky, and made my way over to the bike. The rider lifted the visor of his helmet, revealing a young face with concerned eyes. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. I nodded and said that I was fine. He glanced back at the fog, then at me. "Get on. We need to get out of here." There was no time to think. I climbed onto the back of the bike, wrapping my arms around his waist. He gunned the engine, and the bike lurched forward. The wind whipped my face as we sped down the road, the fog gradually thinning. I looked back once, but there was nothing there, just the fog, thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever might still be out there. We rode for what felt like miles before the fog finally began to lift. The world opened up again, the road stretching out before us, and I started to feel a sense of relief. The rider slowed down, eventually pulling over at a small gas station that appeared out of the darkness, like a beacon. He cut the engine, and the sudden quiet was almost deafening. I climbed off the bike, my legs still weak. I thanked him, my voice still trembling slightly as I tried to express how grateful I was. He shrugged, taking off his helmet and running a hand through his hair. "Glad to be in the right place at the right time," he said, then asked if I needed to call someone. I nodded, pulling my phone from my pocket. To my relief, I had a signal now. I called Mike, explaining what had happened, my voice still shaky. He promised to come pick me up right away. The rider watched me, concern still etched on his face. "You sure you're okay?" I took a deep breath, nodding. "Yeah, I think I will be." He gave me a small smile, then climbed back onto his bike. "Take care of yourself," he said before revving the engine. I watched him ride off until his taillight disappeared into the night. I stood there for a moment, then sat down on the curb, trying to steady my breathing. The fog had lifted, but I still felt on edge. I didn't know who that guy was or why he came after me, but I knew I'd never forget his cold stare or the way he appeared without warning. A few minutes later, the gas station attendant came out, offering me a cup of coffee and a place to sit inside while I waited for Mike. I accepted gratefully, the warmth of the cup steadying my hands. As I sat there, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I realized how close I had come to something truly terrible, and I knew I was never taking those back roads alone again. It was a cold November evening, around 9 p.m., and I was on my way back home after a long, tiring day. My sister had a small accident earlier, and I rushed over to help her. Thankfully, she was okay, just a few bruises and a scare. But the whole thing left me feeling completely worn out. All I wanted now was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget about everything that had happened. Driving usually helped me clear my head, so I tried to relax as I made my way through the desert. The empty highway was usually kind of peaceful, but tonight, something about it felt different. The loneliness of the road felt heavier, and I couldn't shake this weird, uneasy feeling. My car's headlights were the only lights on the road, and I was driving through a remote stretch near Monument Valley. It really felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, no signs of life at all. The air was dry, and the desert stretched on forever. It was just me, the road, and a whole lot of emptiness. I had been driving for hours, just listening to the steady hum of the tires and the occasional rumble of the engine. My phone had no signal, and the radio couldn't pick up any stations. I wasn't too worried, though. I had enough gas to get to the next town, and the night was clear. All I had to do was keep driving. Then, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. Tiny points of light far in the distance. At first, I figured it was just another car, maybe someone else out here like me. But the lights weren't steady. They flickered on and off, almost like they were signaling each other. I frowned, glancing at the road ahead, then back at the mirror. The lights were getting closer, and I realized there were several of them. I could see multiple vehicles behind me, all with their headlights off, moving fast. They were getting closer and spreading out across the road. I tried to figure out what was going on. Who drives without headlights in the middle of the desert at night? I pressed down on the gas, trying to speed up and put some distance between us. Their engines got louder, and I could see their shapes more clearly. Trucks and SUVs, at least 3 or 4 of them. They were catching up to me, their dark forms barely visible in the night. I stayed focused on the road, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my palms sweating. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I needed to get away. I kept my foot on the gas, the engine roaring as I pushed the car faster. The road was straight, and I hoped it would stay that way for a while. The desert stretched out on both sides, just sand and scrub with no help in sight. The vehicles behind me kept coming. Their engines roared as they closed in, trying to surround me. I gripped the steering wheel harder, my knuckles aching. I glanced at the speedometer, 90 miles per hour and climbing, but they were still gaining on me. One of the trucks pulled up next to me, its headlights still off. I could barely see the driver, but I could feel them watching me. They swerved toward my car, and I had to veer to the right. My tires skidded on the gravel at the edge of the road, and I fought to keep control. My arms tense, every muscle working to keep the car steady. There was no way I could outrun them, not with them closing in from all sides. I had to do something to get away. Up ahead, I saw a break in the road, a narrow dirt path leading into the desert. It was risky, but it was my only chance. I turned the wheel hard to the right, the car skidding as I left the road and went down the dirt path. The car bounced over the rough ground, headlights flickering as I tried to keep control. The vehicles behind me hesitated for a moment, then followed, their engines roaring as they chased me into the desert. The dirt path was rough, and the car struggled, shaking with each bump. I focused on the path ahead, trying to ignore everything behind me. The trucks stayed behind me, their dark shapes barely visible. I pushed the car as hard as I could, the tires kicking up dust in the headlights. The path twisted and turned, and I could feel the car slipping, the tires losing grip on the loose dirt. I had no idea where I was headed, but I knew I couldn't stop. The path opened up into a wide, flat stretch of desert. I floored the gas pedal, the car speeding up as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and the convoy. The trucks were still behind me, but they were struggling on the rough ground, their shapes bouncing and swerving as they tried to keep up. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the trucks started to slow down. I looked in the mirror and saw them stop, their headlights off. They just sat there, engines running, like they were watching me. I didn't slow down, I kept going, the car shaking over the rough ground, until the trucks were nothing more than distant shapes. I drove for what felt like hours, the desert stretching endlessly around me. I tried to understand what had just happened. Who were they? Why had they chased me? I had no answers. Eventually, I saw lights in the distance. A small group of buildings, a gas station, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. I let out a shaky breath, a wave of relief washing over me as I headed toward the lights. I pulled into the gas station, the car coming to a stop. I sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the wheel, my breaths coming out shaky as I tried to calm down. I got out of the car, my legs feeling weak, barely able to hold me up. The gas station was nearly empty, just a couple of trucks parked by the pumps and an attendant inside. I walked over and pushed the door open. The bell above the door rang, and the attendant looked up, his eyes widening a bit when he saw me. He asked if I was all right. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I actually was. I thought about how tired I felt and said I had just had a rough night. He nodded and gave me a sympathetic look, saying I was safe here and could take my time. I thanked him and went to the counter, reaching for my wallet. I paid for a bottle of water, the cold plastic comforting in my hand. As I stood there, the events of the past hour replaying in my head. I didn't know who those people were or why they had chased me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't take that desert highway again.